The CPCAB Counselling Research Award 2019 was awarded to Peter Blundell for his research titled Responding to Boundary Issues, a Qualitative Study. Counsellor and psychotherapist Alexis de Winter joins Peter to find out more.
Well, my original motivation for this study came when I was training to be a counsellor originally, and I'd noticed that the word boundary had been used quite a lot by the tutors and the lecturers, but also by the students as well, my fellow students, and I just got the impression that actually, although we were using the same word, people were talking about very, very different things. So that was what initially sparked my interest in boundaries. And it wasn't until I started my PhD and was looking for a research question that I decided actually this might be an interesting area to explore.
Mm-hmm. So what do you mean by boundaries?
Well, that's the question, isn't it? It's a very difficult question. Part of my research was actually exploring what do people mean by the term boundaries, and I really purposefully left it very, very open so that I could really explore what were practitioners' understandings and experience of boundaries, rather than what was just out there in the literature, what was actually people's lived experience of that word and that concept in their own counselling practice. So I think that is open to interpretation. What is the term boundary and what does it mean?
And I'm guessing that's sort of quite interesting from a training point of view. Often we're looking at boundaries as the number of sessions, the timing of the session, limits of confidentiality and so forth. But actually, I'm guessing it's something more than that as well, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. I think they are the initial things that we first think about when we think about boundaries. But actually, it can mean a lot more than that for people. I think the usual interpretation is kind of the limitations or the limits of the therapeutic experience. But when you explore the literature and in my research, it became quite evident that actually it can mean a lot more than this, really. Sometimes it can be about how we relate to one another in the therapy room, and kind of identifying whose experience are we feeling when we're in a counselling session. Is it the counsellors or is it the clients? So boundaries is much more nuanced than just what surrounds the therapy itself.
And I'm guessing you're talking there about the therapeutic relationship, which I guess will also be determined by things like your theoretical modality.
Absolutely, yeah.
And your interpretation of ethics.
Exactly, and I think all of that kind of encompasses boundaries, really. There's the ethical aspect, but there is actually the therapy itself and how it develops and changes and how those boundaries evolve over time. So all of those things come into play, and not just what is ethical behaviour for a counsellor.
So rather than just what's black and white, sort of the shades of grey, and I'm wondering if there were some examples of greyness that came up in your research.
Yeah, there was quite a lot of interesting things that came up in the research. One of the main findings that I found was that the practitioners who spoke to me, or the participants, actually identified that their interpretation of boundaries came from their own personal values and personal experience. So although their training and their experience as a counsellor did have an impact, that was minimal compared to their own personal values and experience before they actually undertook their counselling training. And I found that quite interesting, because I think my view beforehand would have been actually it was about the modality and the therapeutic approach that would have had the biggest impact, but that wasn't the case. It was actually people's own experiences of boundaries before they came into counselling that was the biggest influence, really.
And I wonder if you've got an example you can share with us of that.
There was a lady who, one of the participants, who really was quite worried and quite frightened of potential violence from clients, and that underlying fear in herself meant that she put in very, very strict boundaries in terms of how the counselling room was set up. She ensured that she was able to leave the room very quickly if she needed to. And that had come from her own experiences in her own life, and that was something that played on her mind. And so she set up her boundaries in her practice specifically around that issue, and that was something that was very core to her and she felt like that she needed to do. but wasn't based upon her therapeutic approach or ethical behaviour even. It was about what was really important to her.
And I guess that's sort of quite difficult, isn't it? That on the one hand, you know, I've got to be mindful of my own safety, but when does that then impact on my ability to be present with the client in that moment?
Absolutely. And I think for that particular participant, one of the things that she identified was that she didn't realise that she'd been doing that until she spoke in the research, and she realised that actually there was a lot of unconscious processes going on within her about how she did her therapeutic practice regarding boundaries that only came out when she spoke to me and she decided to reflect on it and talk about it. She'd been doing all these things and not even thinking about why she'd been doing it until she spoke about it in the research.
And I guess that for me feels quite important, because we sort of started with, you know, the structure almost of counselling, those particular boundaries that hopefully try and keep it safe, but actually there's something more about that. And I'm sort of thinking of things like, you know, would I give a hug to a client or not? And I guess again, that's a boundary issue, which is also a very personal issue, and whose need is it coming from as well?
Absolutely, and I think one of the other interesting findings that I found from the research was that when I was talking to the participants about what they understood boundaries to be, they really struggled to define that. They really struggled to kind of say what is a boundary and what is not a boundary. But what they found it easier to do was they found it easier to talk about how they responded when there was a boundary issue, okay? Which makes sense, given examples of their therapeutic practice and what's happened actually in their practice. But one of the things that I found was when they were talking about how they responded to boundary issues, quite a lot of the time they were talking about this self-protection of themselves as a counsellor. They did talk about protecting the client and they did talk about advancing the therapy itself, but actually a lot of the time the participants were talking about protecting themselves, so using boundaries to protect themselves when they were faced with specific issues.
Could you tell me a little bit more about that protecting themselves, what that feels important?
So it was really kind of the dominant theme that came out of the participant interviews. There was quite a few different examples of how people looked at protecting themselves. And what I did was I kind of mapped out people's responses and kind of identified 8 different types of response from the participants and how they faced boundary issues. So as I say, some of those were about protecting the client and advancing the therapy, but there was the majority was were examples of people trying to protect themselves in the therapeutic relationship. So one example which I've talked about is the lady who was worried about particular violence from clients and how she set up her therapy room. But there was other examples as well. So some of the participants had been quite fearful of talking about the erotic in therapy. So when there had the client had been attracted to them or they'd had attraction to the client, that had brought up uncomfortable feelings in the counsellor, and so they'd used boundaries to kind of avoid talking about that issue. So they kind of moved away from the subject area and did everything they could not to talk about it in the therapy session.
There's almost a sense of an avoidance then, using a boundary on oneself and therefore on the therapeutic relationship, rather than going in an organic way with the process.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And some of those responses that I identified were identified as an avoidance response, and that they were avoiding the specific issue. In some of the more extreme circumstances, the counsellors actually withdrew from the therapy itself, so either ended the therapy session or ended therapy with the client. So that was another one of the responses, which was a withdrawal response. The avoidance response was something that happened slowly over time. So the counsellors would be faced with a particular issue, they'd have some kind of uncomfortable feeling about it, and then they would kind of slowly move away and kind of avoid talking about it or dealing with it in the session itself. But there was other examples as well. Sometimes it was an appropriate response to protect themselves, which was, again, I identified, where they'd identified actually this was kind of either risky to the client or risky to the therapy itself, and that they needed to put some barriers or boundaries in place to kind of make sure that the counsellor was safe, but also that the client was safe as well. So it was a very complicated kind of dynamic that people were talking about. One of the things I tried to do when I was mapping out the responses was to be kind of non-judgmental about the participants and what they were kind of sharing with me. So I didn't really want to say, oh, this is right and this is wrong. I kind of wanted to just show these are the type of things that people are talking about and the kind of things that they do whilst they're in therapy with the clients.
And did you find a difference, this is coming into my mind, between maybe counsellors who were just qualified or in training to those that were more seasoned and experienced?
It's a really interesting question. I don't think that there was any meaningful difference really in terms of, or a pattern I should say, in terms of how they approached boundaries. One thing that I did identify was that actually all of the people that I interviewed had a unique approach and understanding to boundaries. And there was no kind of commonality really in terms of how long they'd been practicing, the modality that they were using. They were all just so varied, and actually the common denominator was that their own personal experience before they came to counselling really influenced how they then approached it in the therapy sessions.
And that seems quite important. My own personal experience, what is blocking me being fully present and transparent, and I'm wondering therefore where personal therapy and maybe their clinical, well definitely their clinical supervision, how that is supporting them with these type of issues.
Absolutely. One of the things that I identified and I've kind of suggested is some reflective practice tools for the for counsellors and therapists, which kind of identifies and highlights some areas that people might want to explore. So, for example, a lot of the participants' responses were underpinned by feelings of fear, feelings of shame or incompetence, or just uncomfortable feelings that they didn't really know what to do with. So I've identified some questions around that for people to try and explore. When they have those uncomfortable feelings in therapy and they're faced with a specific boundary issue, they should be exploring those feelings. What are those feelings about, and how is it impacting on how you deliver your boundaries to the client and the therapeutic process?
And there's that interesting word there, should be.
Yeah.
Should be reflecting on it. And I wonder what it is that where people or counsellors are struggling to actually be honest and reflect on perhaps what's going on for them, or whether it's so embedded that we're actually not even conscious of it in some ways.
And I think that was possibly the gap, one of the gaps actually that I identified, was that when the participants were asked about boundaries and they were questioned about it, they started a reflective process about that and became much more aware of some of the problems and the issues that might be going on in their own practice. It might not be always natural, maybe in supervision, to talk about those specific issues. If you're given the choice of what you bring and what you talk about, if it's unconscious, you might not think of it's an area that needs exploring. But if you look at some of the tools that I've kind of designed around looking at these feelings of when you're feeling comfortable, it kind of creates a bit more of a focus and an opportunity for people to kind of speak about those things and talk about those things.
Can you tell me a bit more about these tools and how they will support reflective practice on boundaries?
There's two different types of tool, but they're kind of basically the same. They are different sets of reflective questions that you can either use either yourself or in supervision or in training around your understanding of boundaries, okay? So how they've impacted on your own life, how your own values kind of impact on your understanding of boundaries. But then some other questions around when you're faced with a specific boundary issue, how do you feel in that moment? What is that feeling about? Are you feeling fearful, embarrassed? Do you feel that you're competent in dealing with that issue? And all of those kind of step-by-step questions to kind of work through what is it about that issue that is creating those feelings, and then how does that impact on your practice and ultimately the client themselves.
So it's sort of a set of questions that help me to reflect on what's going or coming up for me.
Yes, that's right, yeah.
And I'm just wondering, you know, is so you've been talking about your research, and I wonder how you conducted the research. It sounds like it was through interviews.
Yes, so I interviewed 7 therapists and counsellors. There was 5 person-centred, 1 psychodynamic counsellor and 1 integrative counsellor. Did an hour to an hour and a half interview each. And as I said before, kind of left it very, very open in terms of the questions around boundaries, and really wanted to get to understand how they understood boundaries, what it meant to them personally and professionally. And then I analysed those interviews using interpretive phenomenological analysis to kind of see what were the main themes that came out of those interviews really, and how the participants understood and also experienced boundaries in their practice.
And that's quite a big word, isn't it? Phenomenological analysis. I wonder if you can explain that a little bit.
So the analysis was really about looking at the lived experience of the participants, and really what does the word boundaries mean to them. So we know what's out there in the counselling literature and the guidance that's given by the different membership bodies, but I really wanted to know what does it actually mean to the counsellors and therapists that I interviewed, and how does it impact on their practice, and to be able to get some real life examples of that really.
So what does it really mean for me and my own experience as a therapist?
Yeah.
And you said you looked at 5 person-centred, a psychodynamic and an integrative therapist. And it's quite a small sample, I know, in terms of difference of modalities, but I'm just wondering, was there any difference perhaps between those 3 modalities?
Again, it's really interesting that there was no commonality between therapeutic approaches. So all the person-centred therapists identified a different approach to boundaries and applied boundaries in very, very, very different and unique ways. So there was no commonality. I think there's some stereotypes out there in the literature in terms of how a person-centred or a psychodynamic counsellor or therapist would approach boundaries. But when I interviewed the participants, none of them fitted into that kind of stereotype of the therapeutic model that they were trained in. And actually, it was their own values that really drove how they approached boundaries and not necessarily the modality that they were trained in.
And how did you then develop your sort of self, your set of reflective questions that would support practice?
So I really explored with the participants kind of the underlying feelings that had kind of driven their responses to boundaries. So the main feelings that came out were feelings of fear, shame and uncomfortableness. And so the reflective questions are kind of exploring those feelings in the therapy session and why the counsellor is feeling those feelings. And once they've identified those feelings, what do they do next? How is it impacting on their own practice? So the questions were based on kind of these different responses that the counsellors had identified and given me.
And did you try those out on the participants?
So I didn't try them out on the participants because they were kind of completed quite a bit after I'd completed the interviews. But I have used them in teaching students, and students have said that they find them really, really helpful in terms of a reflective process. They're not something that can be used right in the moment when you're in a counselling session, but something that can be used maybe afterwards to reflect or in supervision or training.
So it's a reflective tool to reflect on my practice and what's going on, and I guess what's blocking me being, again, fully present with that client and transparent with that client in that moment.
Yes, potentially what's blocking you, but also it might be about identifying good practice as well. So actually thinking, well, did I do this for the client's benefit or for my own benefit? And either of those things can be fine, but it's identifying, was it the most appropriate response, or is there something that I could have done differently, which would have been more helpful to the client or even more helpful to myself as a practitioner.
So it sounds like a very supportive and developmental tool at the same time.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it was really important not to be a kind of judgmental tool where you kind of berating people for their own practice. It's more about reflection and kind of understanding your own process when it comes to boundaries. And I think one of the important things was that when I spoke to the participants, they all identified that boundaries were imperative to their own practice, but they didn't have that many opportunities to reflect and really understand about their own process with boundaries, and that they would have really valued having more opportunities to do that.
So I'm wondering if what you're suggesting, or one of the outcomes from the research, is actually we need to pay more than just a perfunctory delivery of it in training, that actually there's something more than just, this is what keeps it safe, but we need to look at it much deeper in some way.
Absolutely. I think that the participants identified that although they knew it was really important, boundaries were really, really important, actually sometimes when they were faced with a boundary issue and they had feelings that they weren't competent to deal with it, or they were worried about how people would view their practice, including lecturers or supervisors, and that kind of made them reluctant to discuss these boundary issues openly and transparently. But I felt that if some of these things had been explored more in training and identified that actually when you're feeling uncomfortable or fearful or embarrassed, actually they're the things that should be explored.
And that's when the learning takes place. And again, I think that feels quite important as well, that sort of feeling of shame. I don't want to tell my supervisor, I don't want to tell my lecturer because I'm going to be judged in some way, and therefore I'm holding these feelings and therefore not actually doing anything with them.
And that was one of the main feelings that came out, was the shame or embarrassment of discussing some of these things with other people and other colleagues. One of the participants identified an area of her practice that she realised that she was quite needy, and that she was working with a client in a way which was more about her and her own needs rather than the client's. But she struggled to talk about that and explore that with anyone because she felt quite embarrassed about how people would perceive that and what would they do once they knew what she was doing. And I think that feeling of shame was something that was throughout all of the interviews really, and the concern and the worry about being judged by other people.
And almost, maybe I'm going off on a tangent here, but there's something about, as therapists, we're not perfect, and actually a lot of our, why would we get it right all the time? Because we're with someone who we don't know, and they're the ones who are the experts in their own lives. We're the only experts in our own life, and somehow we meet in the middle somewhere. And sometimes we're going to get it wrong, and it's okay.
Absolutely, and I think that was some of the things that people were fearful of. Actually, I've made a mistake, who's going to know about this? And sometimes it was about the client as well, judging them and thinking they don't know what they're doing. And sometimes the participants were putting boundaries in place so that they looked competent, they looked professional, but underneath it all, actually, they were a little bit embarrassed that they've done something wrong, or there was something in them that needed exploring, but who do I talk to about that without being judged?
And there's something almost beyond boundaries, isn't there? There's my own self in that process, and how am I perceived by the client? Am I perceived as a professional counsellor, or am I just perceived as someone who doesn't know what they're doing, and how that impacts on my work?
Absolutely, and that idea of professional identity came through quite strongly in terms of the participants wanting to look professional, wanting to look like I do know what I'm doing, and not being vulnerable, I suppose, in front of a client to say, actually, I don't really know about this, or I've got this a little bit wrong. And it came more to the forefront when they were faced with an issue that they didn't have experience with, or hadn't had an understanding of, and that's when they were more likely to kind of put up the barriers and kind of say, oh, I'm dealing with this, and this is what I need to do. But actually behind that, they were actually feeling quite vulnerable and thinking, I'm not sure if this is the right thing to be doing.
And it's interesting, isn't it? I sort of think in the literature, I'm sort of thinking of Carl Rogers when he was working with Gloria and some of Dave Min's stuff. When they actually open to the client and go, actually, I got that wrong, I don't quite understand that. or I haven't got that quite right, or I've put it into a different direction. It's actually in those moments it actually brings the therapy closer together, because we're sort of seen as fallible as well. And
absolutely. In the model that I've drawn up, one of the responses is called the engagement response, and the participants identified about when they were faced with some boundary issues that they felt quite competent in. They engaged with the client and were quite open and transparent with them. This is a problem, this is an issue, how are we going to deal with this? And it was a very important moment in the therapeutic relationship, but it was very open and transparent, and there was no kind of miscommunication going on. And some of those moments were the ones that really advanced the therapeutic relationship. So there was, within the model, participants exploring and explaining how they did that in their practice, but it was interesting that it lent more towards them protecting themselves than quite often looking at the client's needs, and there was a bit of an imbalance there in the examples that they gave.
So there are times when they feel they can be transparent, and at other times when they almost shut down and protect themselves. I don't know what I'm doing here, or this feels a bit scary for me, therefore I'm going to avoid it in some way.
Absolutely, and it was always those issues that they lacked experience in or understanding were the ones that were, oh gosh, I'm really uncertain about this. But rather than I'm going to explore this in supervision, or I've noticed that there's this feeling coming up, the participants quite often put boundaries in place to kind of make sure that they looked professional and competent with the client, and kind of gave them reasons why they were doing that, but didn't always look at that deeper level and understanding of what was the reason and why they were doing that.
And it sounds quite complex, actually. It starts off, you look at the title originally and go, yeah, it's about boundaries, and what could be difficult about that? And actually, when you dig into it, it's actually quite complex and sort of crosses quite a lot of different processes. Our process in supervision, our understanding of self, our theory, our ethics, are all merging into this in some way.
It's definitely a much more complicated process than I envisaged that it would be. Speaking to the participants, there's many layers and nuances to the issue of boundaries, but I think what was interesting was that actually just focusing on the topic itself really drew out people's understanding of what it actually means to them personally and how it impacts on their practice. So even though we were talking about it in a very broad way, it began a process in people which led them to really thinking about their practice on a deeper level. And I thought that was just interesting in itself, really.
And I'm just wondering if there were any limitations to the research that you did, anything that you feel, actually I really want to explore this more, or it would have been useful to have done more of this or that?
I suppose it was only a small scale study, so there was only 7 participants, which is small. So I think it would have been interesting to explore the same set of questions, but with lots of different practitioners from different backgrounds. So I think that would have been useful. I think as well. Obviously, this is just the perspective of the counsellor, which was the aim of the study, but I think it'd be very interesting to have a look at the perspective of the client as well, in terms of how they experience and understand boundaries, and see maybe the differences between the two.
So that sounds like some more research to do, and that sounds like quite interesting. So is there any real difference between our modalities as a therapist, and actually what is the client's experience of boundaries and containment, and what is it they need or feel they're not getting?
Absolutely, and I think because from this research I was able to identify that for the counsellors it was quite a lot of the time about self-protection. I'd be really interested to see how clients really perceive and understand boundaries, and what's their experience of it with counsellors.
And I wonder also if clients are therefore picking up when counsellors are drawing back or protecting themselves in some way, whether they actually feel that and experience that in the relationship.
Potentially, it'd be a really interesting area to explore.
So maybe just to round off, it would be really interesting if you could share your thoughts on what the importance of research is to the counselling profession.
I think research is massively important to the counselling profession. I think it kind of underpins what we do. And it's really important for advancing our own practice. I think from my perspective, completing a research project has been really beneficial for me, and just understanding my own relationship with boundaries in my own counselling practice has been really important. But even just being able to discuss, and whether people agree with research or don't, being able to discuss those issues and raises questions for us to reflect on, I think is really important for us as practitioners.
And that feels important, isn't it? There's that, it's not just, oh, I've done a bit of research, full stop. It's actually, what else does it opens up? What are the limitations here? What could I have done differently? What would inform this body of work more? And it's always about reflecting further on practice.
Absolutely, and where are we going as a profession, and kind of where do we want it to go, and what is research telling us about what is going on in the counselling profession in the here and now?
And I'd like to thank you. I think your research has actually been really important in some ways in looking further into boundaries and our own process, I think, as a practitioner, and where we stand within those boundaries, and almost our own moral and ethical compass sort of comes into that as well. Thank you.